and we are ready to go.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Amanda Avery from the Connect and Communicate Series Planning Committee. Thanks everybody for joining us today for our presentation, which is If I Apply, Updated CRAAP or CRAAP Test for Evaluating Sources. This discussion will be recorded. It'll be made available to the PALA Association College and Research Division members through the PALA website. For this discussion, you only need a headset or speakers. We will encourage you to ask questions in the chat box throughout the discussion, so feel free to go ahead and use that at any time. And we'll attempt to include your questions as appropriate during the discussion or at the end. We'll also do our best to assist participants with technical issues, so please post those issues in the chat box as well. If I Apply is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division's Connect and Communicate series. I'd like to thank the CRD board for supporting the Connect and Communicate initiative and the other Connect and Communicate Planning Committee members, Sarah Pike, Jill Hillam Miller, Eryn Burns, Amy Snyder, Ryan Sittler, and Ronali Chioko. And I'd like to acknowledge PALA for allowing us to bring this discussion to you through Zoom. Thank you to Sarah for doing our closed captioning for today's session. Eryn will be keeping track of attendance today, as she mentioned, so please type in the number of attendees at your location if more than one of you is joining today. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists for today's event. First is Kat Phillips, who is the Nursing and Allied Health Liaison Librarian at Penn State University. We have Sabrina Thomas, who is an Instruction and Research Librarian for Marshall University. And Eryn Rolls is a Research and Instruction Librarian at Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia. And now I'll turn it over to Kat, Sabrina, and Eryn.
This is Kat. Thank you so much, everyone. Sabrina and Eryn, if you're ready to go, you can go ahead and introduce yourselves a little bit more, and then I'll follow up after you.
Hi, I'm Eryn Rolls. As I was introduced, I'm a research instruction librarian here at Marshall University. I'm the English, Digital Humanities, and Appalachian Studies liaison librarian.
I'm Sabrina Thomas, and I am a research and instruction librarian. I'm the primary liaison to the Communications Department, Art and Design, and Women's Studies departments.
And as stated, I'm Kat Phillips. I'm the Nursing and Allied Health Liaison Librarian at Penn State. And to give everyone a really quick background, I used to work at Marshall before I came to Penn State. So I worked with these fabulous librarians when I was there, and we started this project almost a year ago. So that's our all connection together and what we do. So moving forward, we wanted to actually have everybody respond in the chat to a couple of questions to kind of get everybody's brains moving and started, and you know, pop quiz for those of you who weren't expecting it. But one thing we were looking at was, you know, how did we get to this point and what our conversations with each other were in order to leading up to this tool. So Eryn and Sabrina, if you wanted to chime in.
I have always had elements of source evaluation, but it seemed more and more of my class time was being taken over with source evaluation, and it always sort of haunted me, how can I do this better? And of course, I would always bring these conversations up to Eryn and Kat, and we would just sort of troubleshoot between the two of us, or three of us.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've always done it. We've done it differently throughout the years. And as the title kind of alludes to, the CRAAP test, the CRAAP test started as a way of web source evaluation, and we'll get to a little bit more of that later. But our conversations with each other kind of circled around how are we doing this in our classrooms, and what's missing, what conversations are missing, or what conversations are kind of cyclical, circular, or whatever. So we started asking ourselves these questions. As the slide says, you know, this is serious, we need to talk about this. So when you guys are evaluating sources, you personally, what are the top things you look for? And then to further the discussion, have you ever caught yourself spreading misinformation, and how did that happen? And then the most important thing for me is, are you comfortable sharing these stories with your students? Because we've all done it in some capacity, and having these conversations is the biggest step for me. So if you guys want to go ahead and talk about what are the top things you're looking for when you're doing source evaluation, on any level, in any setting, and we'll start that conversation. But for now, we'll go ahead.
Maybe we should start with, do you evaluate your information?
Right. Do your students, do your faculty, do your staff, do your family members and your friends evaluate their information? So while people are mustering up the courage to write about what they do in the chat and maybe some misinformation that they have stated before, and how, you know, what did you do about it? We'll move forward. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of source evaluation that led to the If I Apply test.
So I have been doing this since 2006, and when I went to the immersion teacher track training way back in 2006, they were still definitely talking about the CRAAP test. I had heard of it before, but it was basically created in the infancy of the web, when the websites were still static, so prior to Web 2.0. And it was really in relation to, there was already misinformation being spread almost immediately. And so this was one librarian's attempt to sort of instruct people on just basic website evaluation. It wasn't at that point meant for other types of information. It was largely directed solely at the new World Wide Web. So that's a little bit brief history. I have always used elements of it. Maybe I didn't always call it the CRAAP test, but I always stuck to its basic premise, its core, for evaluating sources.
Yeah, and people have talked about it in other ways, have named it other things, but I think we've all kind of been aware of it over the years.
Right.
Sure.
And it's a really good place to start.
It is, and I've definitely heard it also referred to as the cracker, just kind of another acronym for it. So, so Brad Long from Hershey has said that he really looks for reliably accurate and current medical information from credible resources, which makes sense given that he's at the medical school, and you know, definitely talks about the fact that it's easy to spread inaccurate information when we're looking at hot button topics in politics and things like that. Eryn, you know, other people have said they tend to look for authors and original resources. So this is great conversation. Thank you for those who have responded to the chat that talk about what you look for. And, you know, definitely the type of information we're then disseminating to our patrons and the people we interact with in terms of evaluating resources. So keep those comments coming. We'll keep checking back in the chat as we go through everything.
Okay, so this is Eryn again. So we've talked about how the CRAAP test was kind of developed and what it was used for. Sabrina said it well when she talked about static resources, resources that don't necessarily change very much, or how we perceive them changes very much. I think the issue that's developed into where we are now is that we need to be more active and dynamic, obviously, because our sources are more active and dynamic. They're ever changing. Think about how many sources your students are using, how many resources we have at our fingertips, essentially. So we have to kind of evolve with those resources and how we interact with them. So learning has to be active and dynamic, and not just a thing that we do over and over in the same way. So that being said, that source evaluation test CRAAP is fine. But after we were handed the ACRL framework, it kind of gave us the flexibility that we needed. I know that in my classrooms, I felt a little bit static before this happened because there were standards and, ways of actually hitting those learning outcomes and things like that. And the framework really opened up my flexibility. It opened up the classroom for me. It opened up that conversation. Having those frameworks to work around really just kind of set me free in terms of how I would bring information into my classroom, how I would bring source evaluation into my classroom. It really brought us into what Sabrina calls that information ecosystem that we've come to know and love or not love. I'm not sure how you guys feel about it. But it really did free up the conversation I was having in my classroom in order to give students more freedom in terms of what they're looking for, because they have so much at their fingertips in order to access. I mean, not even talking about just their academic access in terms of their university access, but I mean, just the internet in itself is a huge and very flexible and very intermingling place, right? So we have to figure out how to have a conversation about that. And we've noticed that emotions have gotten their way into our research and our conversations. So Sabrina and Kat and I started noticing that more and more and more in our classes, not necessarily just, looking at a book source, an article source, and a newspaper source, and that being the types of sources students are using. They're coming back with a lot more things. They're coming back with a lot more nuanced sources that needed that flexibility in order to evaluate them and use them properly.
Absolutely. There was a point in time where you would never have thought, well, obviously I'm going to use this tweet, or I would need to evaluate a tweet for authority. And that is where we're at. The information ecosystem is changing so fast that we are at a point now where we do need to talk to students about evaluating Twitter, which is a brave new world, right?
And another thing we were talking about, and we'll get into this a little bit more later on in the presentation, was the fact that each resource needs to be evaluated in the context of the project or the information being sought. So like Sabrina and Eryn just mentioned, tweets. An example I use frequently would be blogs, are that every source of information has a time and a place that it will likely be an acceptable resource. So we're looking at this not just from a research paper, you're at the reference desk, or you're interacting with patrons on that level, like that academic level, but it's on all levels. So that's where we were running into everything was so prescribed. Like Eryn said, it was so rigid. It didn't have the flexibility that, it's a blog, therefore it's not acceptable, or it's a .com, therefore it is or isn't acceptable, it's a .org. And we're finding that our patrons, our students, our faculty, given that we're all in the academic sector, that's who we interact with the majority of our time. Sabrina does a lot more community work and has that interaction that she'll talk about as well. But that we were falling into these, and the people we interacted with were falling into these, well, if it doesn't check all these check boxes, then it's not a credible resource. Or if it does check all of these check boxes, then great, this is fabulous. It is a credible resource. And it wasn't, you know, whether it was the website that talks about concrete airplanes. If you were to apply the CRAAP test to that website passes the CRAAP test with flying colors because it doesn't necessarily look at logic. Logically, we all know that a concrete airplane won't fly. If it can, that's fabulous. And maybe a Nobel Prize should be given to that person in like physics or something. But, you know, like that's why that is part of the conversation we were having as well. You know, and at the end of the presentation today, I'd be interested to hear what types of conversations you all are having as well, amongst yourselves, amongst your colleagues, amongst your patrons.
So I've always taught source evaluation. However, I have not always gotten text messages on weekends from professors asking when I can come into their classroom and when is my next possible available time. And that's when I knew something was going on. There was bigger issues afoot, and that is with the onslaught of fake news and viral misinformation. Traditionally, when you used CRAAP, or when I used CRAAP, I should say, when I used that, it was static, traditional sources. It was very easy to hold up either a very good website or a very bad website, and it was really easy to sort of shuffle things into good or bad. And what happened with the advent of social media, and it didn't happen instantly, but over time, what happened is that you saw the intentional and both the intentional and unintentional manipulation of information. And it's important that our students know that personalized search results and echo chambers create the illusion that they are always correct and that more people think like them than actually do. And that's why the If I Apply test is excellent to combat fake news. And when I do talk to community groups, I really stick with If I Apply because it's not just academic. Yes, and we will talk about how you can increase your students' grades, and that's important. But what I look at this as sort of a way to survive right now with social media, because people, just average people, not just our students, they're getting their news, but more and more from social media. And if you look at your news feed, legitimate news from the New York Times looks very, very similar to both clickbait and fake news. So that's in and of itself, at face value, these things, they sort of look alike. And if our normal average person out there doesn't know the difference and isn't really evaluating their information, then you can be sure that our students aren't either. And while I do want them to go out and be in their profession and know how to evaluate their profession's information and have them have good grades and be successful, I also want them to be successful information consumers. And information is in so many different ways because of the changing information environment that we need to give students new tools, more flexible tools to be able to combat this viral misinformation. And because fake news, the term has been co-opted, and a lot of people, it's either what fake news and what it isn't. Fake news has always been around. If you were, and the crazy thing is I did classes on fake news back in like 2012. And when you talked about fake news in 2012, it was satire. We were talking about Jon Stewart, right? Stephen Colbert, and then Colbert Report. But as it moved on, fake news was intentional misinformation intended to sway public opinion, and also clickbait. And then there was a movement to co-opt the term again, fake news, into information that you just don't like, that it makes you feel bad, so it must not be true. So what I've been doing in classes is talking about the term fake news and using it just in the beginning as sort of a framework of how to talk about it, define it, and then really hitting the idea of viral misinformation from many different ways and intentional manipulation. And when you frame it like that, you get more buy-in from students because it's not about political polarization. Instead, I move it to basically how not to be a chump and get taken in by bad information. Anyway, so that's how I've been talking about fake news.
Yeah, I think we've all had those conversations in class. I can't count how many times I've said something and students have kind of winced at me or looked at me with big eyeballs. And it makes me feel like I want to, step back into that bush. Because emotions are really high right now. And I keep saying right now, but in the past, few years, I've seen a shift in the classroom. So how do we get our students who didn't do this before, but definitely now, how do we get students to set aside their emotions? And the biggest term for me is radically engage with logic and reason. And what I mean by radically and what we mean by radically is to actually look at things in a different way than they normally would. To set aside their high levels of emotions and look at things with reason and self-imposed information literacy seeking habits, right? So how do we do that? We use if I apply, right? So we're going to go through the steps. The first few steps are the most important for me, especially simply because those are those personal steps, and then the apply section is something we're aware of, but has shifted obviously. Emotions completely block a person's logic a lot of times. And I've noticed that in class. How many students do you know choose a topic because they're personally invested in the topic, or because someone they love is personally invested in that topic, or because of just how they feel about it, right?
Or because their instructor told them, pick a topic that you feel strongly about, which is fine.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're going to shift in and talk about these steps. So those first steps, right? So the personal steps are the biggest and often lead to a lot of discussion. So identifying your emotions attached to the topic and actually identifying them, not knowing that you just have a feeling or you just, you're someone you love or invested in has been affected by something that you want to do research in or whatever. I mean, we're having these conversations right now. It seems like we're having these emotional conversations every day. So identifying that there are actual emotions attached to the topic. There are, you do have biases set already within that topic. And then having that, finding unbiased reference sources for a proper review of the topic. This is the biggest step for me in terms of being able to identify reference sources and knowing what they are and knowing what kind of information they provide. So identify your emotions and find those unbiased reference sources. And then having the intellectual courage to seek authoritative voices on a topic that those voices they may be outside of your thesis, they may be outside of your comfort zone, they may be outside of whatever. And this kind of, we do this and we've talked about doing this, but we don't point out that this is what our brains are actually doing when we're in that research process. And pointing at it and saying, look at how you feel, look at where your biases sit, and actually bringing it into the light has been a big game changer for me in the classroom.
Absolutely. You need to really focus your students on challenging their confirmation bias. And I do this in the moment that they start sitting down and logging onto their computers after I introduce myself. And one of the ways that I do this is through storytelling. And because in order for people to feel safe to share, their own thoughts, it really has to begin with the teacher. So, and also this isn't just, these personal steps aren't, again, just for evaluating sources for academically. When I have been bitten by fake news and misinformation, especially on social media, it is almost always started with an emotional topic. I'll give you an example. I saw on social media an article posted from a friend where it said, "Are you starving your son's brain?" Well, of course, I'm a mom and I have a son, and this gut fear of, wait a minute, is he not eating correctly? Is there something where I'm starving his brain? And I read the article and I was like, oh my gosh, his brain has different needs than my daughter's brain. And I shared it, and the second I shared it, and then I was like, oh wait, I think I got my emotions overrode my logic. Sure enough, I go to our reference sources, I look at it, and I giggle now because, I mean, how crazy is it that different, gendered brains would need different nutrients? It is not scientific. But the trouble is having people, one, stop to think about their emotions, right? Challenge their confirmation bias. But in order to do that, I try to make it as easy for them as possible. This is where Credo comes in, and our reference databases that are tailored specifically for ease of use. So they will be able to look really quickly and see just factual stuff. And I say, this is right at your fingertips. All you have to do is go right to this website and click on this database. But anyway, yeah, those personal steps. Without the personal steps, those source steps are not going to hold as true, because you're always going to favor the information that makes you feel good about your emotions. So you have to do the personal steps first before you ever even begin to do the source steps individually. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it does.
With you, Sabrina. We're not biased or anything. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the source steps in how we have taken looking at these steps and applied the tool and really used this basic source evaluation that looks, quite honestly, very similar to CRAAP, or what a lot of people have been doing in the past, and kind of how we've then molded it to go along with this frame of mind and this frame of reference. In one of my big focuses when I talk about the source steps and teach this in class and use this tool with the public in that non-academic setting, is to have everyone look for bias. So yes, we can establish authority, we can look for purpose and point of view, who's the publisher, is there an agenda, look at the bibliography, and look at the year of publication. Like, these are very basic things that I think on some level, even people who say, I don't really evaluate my resources, probably do at least a little bit. So one thing I wanted to talk about is authority is established. So one thing that catches people all the time is that they have to go beyond what a person calls themselves or where a person works. So frequently, if we're in this academic setting and we look at a research article, you can see where the different authors work, which is fabulous. That does establish authority. So that's something that students or the general population might not look at in that academic sense. But you have to look at authority also. Is the authority biased in what they're writing? So part of what I bring up is an example of a book that we have here in the Life Sciences Library on the 4th floor of Paterno at University Park at Penn State. And And we have a book that really leads to more questions about how much bias and how much authority does the author have in authoring this book. So this book was published in the 1960s. It talks about a new psychological theory that had very much like If I Apply, it's the three of us that got together and started talking about this tool and have now created this tool and are now talking about this tool, right? So in that same sense, this new psychological theory had a kind of a main head person, a gentleman, a doctor, a psychologist, and who was the authoritative figure that people look to. Because this was a new theory, you know, we're not looking at a ton of publications, a ton of studies out there. You know, this is early on. And he authors a book that really looks at this theory and has a sizable bibliography at the end. Now, this author's last name does begin with A, so they, you know, as they cite themselves throughout the book, their references all appear first, just alphabetically. In the references, there are about 65 or 70 references. The first 19 are works published by this author. So my question for students, or for whomever, for everyone here in this conversation would be, yes, he is an authority in the field. Yes, we've established that he's an authority, you know, and a third of the references are his own publications. So what level of bias is in the book? What level of authority does that add to or take away from the book? And obviously there have been many publications since then in this psychological theory. And does the year of publication, which is our last, our Y, play a major part in the bias and authority of this book? Because there wasn't a lot of research and there weren't a lot of, obviously not a ton of publications that could be cited or could be talked about. So this is when the source steps aren't just check boxes. This is when the source steps really start to look at just because someone has put doctor in front of their name does not mean that they're an authoritative figure. So frequently people will stop at that point and say, oh, Dr. So-and-so is referred to as an expert. Well, that's fabulous, but what are they a doctor of? So you have to research your research. You have to dig deeper, which I feel that we encourage students and patrons to do, but it's not necessarily ingrained as part of our natural, like we tend to defer to authority. So when we're looking at purpose and point of view, what sort of language is used in the resource? So Sabrina talked about, you know, this really tugged at my heartstrings. I'm a mother, I have a son. Oh my gosh, I'm starving his brain. But wait a minute, does it really matter that I have a son and daughters and they all eat the same food? Like, you know, most people, unless, you know, there are other circumstances, at least how I, you know, when I grew up, I have a little brother and we always ate the same thing for dinner and we both turned out just fine. Tom, maybe not so much. So maybe there was some light to that article, Sabrina, but, you know, we have to encourage people to always look for the bias that could exist in the resources. When we look at our list of sources, this also goes into play when you look at certain types of research. If we're in an academic standpoint, again, let's say in the cosmetic field. So frequently there will be strong publications in the cosmetic field that will include a poor citation as a resource. So the citation itself is fine, but the resource is not great. So sources like Cosmopolitan or Teen Vogue have been known to be cited in academic cosmetology and other types of research articles. And does that actually take away from the article itself, or does it not? So definitely looking at these source steps in terms of it's all gray. It's all a gray area. And also to have everyone remember with the entire If I Apply test, not just the source steps, that there is always a time and a place for information. So just because we come across a website, for example, that is not a credible website, I will use this example that I've used in class. For anybody who is familiar with martinlutherkingjr.org, it is a website that at face value no longer, but used to at face value pose as a historical counting of Martin Luther King's life. So if anybody's heard of it, you probably know that it is run by the man who founded Stormfront. He was a former member of the KKK, and Stormfront is a fringe supremacy group. Danielle, I saw your question come up. We will address that shortly. What we're looking at is that absolutely this is not a website that should ever be used if you are writing a thesis that talks about the life and history and movements in the civil rights movement, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that definitely caught graduate students off guard kind of before the CRAAP test was a thing that was taught. And it was used as a credible resource, right? So that's kind of the background of this website. However, does that make this website 100% not a credible resource across the board all the time? And this is when the personal steps come in, that I don't like the answer to that question. In my opinion, the answer is no. That website could potentially be used as a credible resource in certain circumstances. For example, if we are looking at information posted on the internet that may or may not be true, you know, no matter where you stand, no matter what you agree with, this could definitely be a site that could be talked about when we're looking at freedom of speech, when we're looking at different groups, no matter who they are, when we're looking at algorithms. Part of the buzz about this particular website is there's an algorithm embedded into its code that makes it always appear in the top 10 hits when you Google Dr. King. So it appears frequently, and it's not just because people click on it all the time. So there are points in time that you would have to step back and say, yeah, I guess I could say that in the right circumstance, this would be a credible resource. And that's a very extreme example, but the same thing goes for tweets, the same thing goes for blog posts, the same thing goes for books that we have on the shelves in the library. Students, most frequently faculty as well in an academic setting, tend to think that, oh, it's on the shelf in the library, so it must be a credible resource. Is that true or is that not true? And you still have to encourage everyone to go through all of these steps. And I'm not going to grab that book because it counters my thesis. It doesn't go along with my values. I'm not going to pull that book from the shelf. And that can be at any library. It doesn't just have to be at an academic library. But would that have been a good resource to round out your topic also? So that's when the personal steps come in. Eryn and Sabrina, did you want to add anything?
I do know that my students tend to think that year of publication automatically makes something credible. For example, almost like a new phone, like the best would be 2018. Well, you see, the best information always has to be 2018, regardless of the topic or the source. It's almost as, and in fact, if I ask them in class often, they'll say, when I say, how do you evaluate your sources for credibility? They will say, well, when was it published? Was it published this year? And the author and establishing the author's education and experience in that topic is second or even third down the line from year of publication, which when I talk about year of publication, I always talk about topic, like what. It depends largely on what you're talking about, like what are you investigating first. So yeah, definitely it is interesting to first ask your students what they already do and then really listen in on what they're thinking and their thought process. because it's pretty amazing what they're currently doing and what they're currently thinking, and how they evaluate credibility.
Right.
So incorporating If I Apply into your classes, there's always the one-shots on the lower levels, and I do a lot of speech classes through communications. I find If I Apply at least going very smoothly for me, because they have to do informative speeches that lead into the next speech is a persuasive speech based off of your informative speech. Well, right off the bat, we can talk about the personal steps of the If I part of the If I Apply, because even though it's an informative speech, right, they're still going to want to prefer the information in their informative speech that agrees with their feelings. And I really do challenge them that if I can get them to give a clear understanding of their emotions attached to the topic that they get to choose, because they get to choose the topic, then they're going to have a better informative speech. And then what I really do challenge them is you don't want to mislead them ever. You don't want to mislead your audience. Anyway, so that's one-shots. I find one-shots are perfect because you get to show off the databases. We have Summon, and we get to show off Summon, but first I get to show them the reference databases and then lead them into Summon. And so upper level classes, you would assume that they would be doing already a lot of source evaluation. Don't assume this. I have had upper level classes, and they have not been identifying emotions or biases towards their topics. In fact, they're quite clear about how they already feel and what they want to already prove. So it does apply to upper level classes as well. And the community classes, I definitely make sure to talk about, because again, so much of our language is now polarized. I almost stick with community. I talk about evaluating all content, and so that you're not manipulated unknowingly, and sort of as a preservation of self and friends and family. This fits naturally into online courses, and we already have research guides connected to If I Apply. And absolutely, anytime you can get a hold of high school students, the earlier the better. I also go teach to high school teachers, high school librarians, pretty much anyone who will listen. I talk about the source evaluation, especially in connection with social media. But anyway.
Yeah, I do a lot of the same types of classes that Sabrina does, except like English 101s and first year seminars and things like that. So getting them in on that ground level is really important. And I also go into high school classrooms and do the same thing, especially Marshall has a lot of high school, like English 101s and those communications classes that students are already taking in high school. So it's good to start them early. I meet with my faculty departments, so I kind of push myself into those faculty meetings before semesters start, when they're starting to think about their syllabi and everything like that, and I share everything with them, because I mean, we're librarians, automatically we share anyway. So this past fall, I paired it with, we have Credo information literacy modules. I don't know if anyone's aware of those. Those can be easily dropped into your Blackboard systems or your learning management systems. So I paired this test in congruence with the Credo information literacy modules, because students need to know what this stuff is before they actually use it. So a student needs to know what a journal is before they actually go looking in that journal. Students need to know what sources they're looking at and know how to define all these things, first of all. This doesn't happen magically in their brains, obviously. So meeting them on the ground level also kind of, you have to make up that ground, because you don't really get them after they've learned all that stuff already. So the Credo Information Literacy Model just does a good job of setting that ground and working up and towards source evaluation. So I used this with the learning literacy modules, and it worked out really, really, really well. They paired really nicely together. And just make it available for anyone who's interested. I've handed this is this image is one that I use in class. It's pretty standard. Of course, we'll be sharing this handout if you'd like. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, this is something that we use in class. This is a particular sheet that I hand out. So, and I like to leave it in Blackboard classes too, because students can't lose it, right? It's always there. So making sure that you share your materials and share all your resources in ways that students can keep their hands on, and for faculty to keep in places too. That's very, very important.
So how do we assess this? Because really we have to figure out whether or not it's working well. The first thing that I did to begin to evaluate source evaluation is get buy-in from the professors to add source evaluation to the rubrics. For example, in the speech classes, I took their rubric that they already used for their speeches, and I didn't redo anything or create anything special. I just inserted that they had, when it said had to use quality sources, I said had to use quality sources, and then I laid out the framework of what those would be. And in their speeches now, they have to say where they got their information and who the author is and what gives them the education or experience to be talking about the subject. So that way they have to justify the quality of their sources. Another thing that I did is I built in source evaluation into the assignment. Another really simple way to do that is with your annotated bibliography, as well as with a summary. Directly under the summary, they have to do a full source evaluation on the source. And if they can't find a bibliography, then they have to say there was no bibliography. And then again, justify the credibility of the source. So that's the best, my way of doing assessment just right now.
So I've done assessment as well in terms of when I've used this in classes. So I have two brief examples before we move on to your questions of how I've assessed the success of using If I Apply in classes. So I usually teach an English 102 research and writing course online. And when I first started this class, I created a website credibility assignment because I was getting research papers that had just terrible resources that students were using. So before they even start the research paper, they do this website credibility essay. And I was seeing the same mistakes happen every single semester. And so the way the assignment is graded is a majority of the points are assigned for resource selection and critiques. So why did they say that this was or was not a credible resource? They have to critique it. And I did compare grades from the 7th semester and 8th semester that I did this assignment because there were no changes to the assignment in that point in time. My rubric stayed the same, but my introduction to the If I Apply tool was the only thing that changed between the two semesters. And I did see an 8.6% overall grade average increase, which is fabulous. However, I want to say that the limitation to this increase is that I am the one working on If I Apply, obviously. I am the one who is grading these assignments. So while I do grade based on a rubric and I do remain as unbiased and cold and emotionless as possible, there is always an emotional factor in there that, just needs to be addressed. So there's that. And then I was brought in this semester by an instructor, so I am embedded into an online class who does a What's on the Web assignment, which is very similar, that she has her students go out and find websites for 4 different topics. It's the same assignment, but they do it 4 times in the semester. And she was getting results like Yahoo Answers. She did have like an OK magazine article was one that she got last semester. So we created the If I Apply What's on the Web pre-activity that they learned about. They learned If I Apply, and they did this activity, and the instructor has reported significantly improved resource selections for the What's on the Web #1 assignment that students just completed. So I don't have grade statistics on that yet. She's still finalizing that, but she did see marked improvement over past semesters. So that's some of the assessment I've done and how I've kind of used it in class. I also use it in one-shot instruction. I haven't thoroughly assessed my one-shot instruction yet. I'm still working with the instructor on that, but I just wanted to give you a little insight into what I've done. And at this point, we are done speaking. We would love to hear your questions, your comments, and your criticisms. The only way for us to, or for the community of librarians and information professionals as a whole, to improve and continue to help our patrons and our communities improve their information seeking abilities is for people to also criticize. So we love constructive criticism, and we will take any questions at this time.
And obviously, you're welcome to email us questions. You'll get our email at the end here. So if you're shy or if you have a lot of questions or a lot of criticisms, please share them in any way you feel comfortable. Of course, this is we've only been working on this for about a year, so it obviously will continue to be improved upon.
Right.
Yeah, any feedback at all would be really appreciated.
So thank you, Sarah, for your comment. I think the model is awesome. We do too, so not gonna lie. And Brad said one issue he runs into is how to evaluate the medical student community created websites such as like prepping for board exams. That's really hard, Brad. Alice, we can send out the presentation. So I think when we're looking at resources, Brad, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that working with nursing students when they're prepping for like NCLEX, there's a lot of information out there that's misinformation on how to prep for the NCLEX or any sort of board exams. Is that what you're talking about? But yeah, okay. So when you're looking at exam prep, there's a lot of like scammy, we just kind of want to take your money type websites. Some study materials are better than others. Danielle asked if she can use the apply paper you created. Eryn and Sabrina, do you want to answer that?
I do not have a problem with that.
I don't either. And Danielle, in the last slide, I do have a link. So when you get the slide, I have a link. I created a LibGuide, and you're welcome to take from the LibGuide as well. It mirrors the paper. It's just in an electronic format.
Yes, please use this. Feel free to share it far, far and wide. Viral misinformation is predicted to get worse. So yes, please. As much as you want. I'm threatening to get it tattooed.
So, this is Eryn. We're coming up on almost 2 o'clock, but I did want to point out that I can take, if you wanted to send me your files as the PowerPoint and the PDF for the handout, I can definitely get them on the CRD page as well.
Beautiful. So we will send those to you pronto. And Brad, yes, current students passing themselves off as test prep experts. Yeah, that's, yeah. Yeah.
Before everyone starts to disappear, I noticed that we were up to 40, now we're down to 31. I'm going to go ahead and post an evaluation link into the into the chat box.
We have another quick question. As far as suggestions on how public librarians can encourage your patrons to practice if I apply. Yes, I have a counterpart at Cabell Public Library, and he does do presentations where he talks about source evaluation. And again, you guys are free to use the if I apply method. You can also, I'm not opposed to just making posters of the actual handout on the reference desk. We are also research librarians, so when you're sitting on that desk, when students come over, and I'm sure you have patrons come over and they say, I want to prove this, I want to prove that, and instead what I do is I kindly but firmly give them overviews of the topic and then show them the myriad of different information out there so that they can then begin to evaluate those sources. But I do 100% one-on-one talk to people about, I don't always call it if I apply, but I said first you have to check your emotions, because your emotions sometimes block the way that you view credible or not so credible information. So that's what I would suggest for public librarians. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, this test is really nice because it can work on so many different levels. I've used it with high school students. I've used it with graduate students. So it just really depends on what the need is. In terms of my experience in the public library, as a reference librarian there, you kind of treat it the same way you would. You just have different access. And you talk about those different types of sources that are out there and give them a little better critical eye, if you will, in terms of using those.
And I think part of it also is in our conversations with patrons. We're not always going to be necessarily presented with the opportunity to say, hey, there's this really great kind of process or thing you can do to look at it. So part of what I do here, yes, in the academic library, but I think this can be applied across the board, is just in how I have conversations with people about the information they're looking for, and in like Eryn and Sabrina just said, going through the different steps but not actually talking about the different steps when I'm assisting someone, so that it's kind of like a hidden, like the tool is hidden even though it's in the forefront of my conversation, because not everyone wants to hear about a tool. To be honest, it doesn't matter whether you're a student or in a public library, or in a special library or a high school, so sometimes just having that conversation, and for us to just be as unbiased as possible when we're having those conversations as well, to also check our own emotions, which is hard for any topic, for anything.
Great. So this is Amanda jumping in again. I don't know if anybody has any last minute comments or questions, but I just wanted to thank our presenters, Kat, Sabrina, and Eryn, for this awesome resource, and everybody else as well for your great questions. I also just wanted to again point out in the chat box, there is a link to the evaluation for today's session. And also if you're interested in applying for CE credit for today's session and you've joined us live, there is a link to a form in that evaluation that you can use to go ahead and apply for that credit. Also, the recording of this presentation will be available to PALA members early next week through the PALA website. If you're not currently a PALA member and you're interested in becoming a member, you can email anybody on the committee and someone will contact you. You can also contact us with your suggestions for future discussions and presentations, and especially if you would like to present, you can contact one of us directly about that. So everybody, enjoy the rest of your afternoon and have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.